I want to welcome everybody to the MFA program's Distinguished Writer Series. And tonight we have Charlie Williams right there. And before I introduce Charlie, I just want to give you an idea of how the evening will go. First, Charlie will read. Then there'll be a brief Q&A. And then Charlie will be happy to sign books. So just a few announcements before we begin. I just want to tell you some of the other readers are going to have. Robert Polito will be reading poetry. There'll be Hilton Ulse, Edwidge Danticat, and Karen Russell, and they'll all be reading prose. So welcome, and I will now introduce Charlie Williams. I've known Charlie for a long, long time. It's always a thrill to introduce a friend. I remember I met Charlie a long time ago in Paris, and you took Ellen and me out, to the Chinatown. It was a Turkish restaurant? Well, yeah, I'll tell you what my memory of it was. We went to a Chinese restaurant, and Charlie chose all the courses. Anyway, it's a thrill to have him. Charlie has won literally everything. Pulitzer Prize, National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, you name it, he's won it. So enough of that. Now, no matter whom he's with or what he's doing, in my mind, Charlie Williams is always the youngest, most vital person in the room. And though as a matter of course he offers younger people immediate terms of equality, this is a confession I have to make. Don't worry, it's not embarrassing. I've always been a little in awe of him. I've been reading his poems religiously for close on to 30 years, but I can never, ever predict the next impulse he'll be writing out of. His last two books are among his absolute best in a long career in which you can't help but feel in every poem that he's ever written the alertness of a mind and heart, always restless to find not only a clarification of life, but an expansion of it. Unlike any other poet now writing, he gives the art depth and scope. Only Robert Lowell's large-hearted engagement with American history and the missile-mad, Dr. Strangelove absurdities and brutalities of the Cold War comes close to Charlie's unsparing look at our contemporary social ills and evils. The difference between the two poets is that one was born inside the walls of our fast-declining Rome, while Charlie has always been the canny, analytical, passionately skeptical outsider. Where Lowell was brilliantly and proudly elegiac, Charlie has always been attuned to the difficult contradiction in Yeats's words of trying, quote, to hold reality and justice in a single thought. And in that pursuit, he's naturalized for poetry huge swaths of vocabulary, habits of mind, and subject matter. Think of using a word like decathecting as a poem's lyrical climax, or making jealousy as a lens to see the world through, or in his great poem, Combat, creating a speaker who explores the concept of the purifying Jew via his own brilliantly anatomized 21-year-old lust for the daughter of one of Hitler's German generals who, after failing to assassinate Hitler, kills himself. As you'll see, his poems are a wonderfully strange amalgam of the dramatic and meditative lyric in collision with the passionately philosophical and ethical mind. In his great poem, Tar, about the 3 Mile Island nuclear spill, he's created a language that seamlessly connects both public and private dread. The detail about the president wearing a pair of absurd protective booties while inspecting the nuclear plant is both a little masterpiece of direct observation and a down-home way of saying everything that can be said about how our technological world has run amok. As so often happens in Williams's poems, the ludicrous and the tragic are inseparable. You can see this at work in his magnificent sequence of poems about jealousy and Dream of Mind, or in his recent poems, Writers Writing Dying and Draft 23, both comic tour de forces that are also odes to the imagination. And in his completely sui generis most recent book, All at Once, a volume of prose poems that contains some of the best poems, including love poems, that the poet has ever written. This book has nothing in common with what many poets' prose poems sound like, a string of surreal images, both timeless and hackneyed. Instead, in this volume, all of Williams's genius is on high alert. In one poem about a teenaged orphan girl in Uganda that he and his wife Catherine are visiting for the first time after having sent her money and letters for many years, Williams's account is one of the most complex and moving poems I've ever read on navigating cross-cultural differences. How much of our common life he gets into this poem and into all of his poems, and with how much brio, affection, and linguistic wildness. I notice that I've used the word great and genius several times in this introduction. I'm not given to hyperbole, as anyone who knows me can tell you. The most direct way that I can speak about my love of tonight's reader's work and of him is to simply say that whenever I'm afflicted with poetry gloom, whenever I want to feel the nobility and fineness and pleasurable seriousness of the art at its highest pitch, I turn to Charlie Williams.
Sitting down, but I hope I'm tall enough for people to see me. Can you hear me? Speaking of me. I thought I would start, I had a big conflict. I have a book coming out, my selected later poems. The title I don't like much. I don't like that word later. It's too close to late. So that's coming out, and I thought, well, maybe to. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now, yeah.
David?
Yeah, now.
Okay, sorry.
Anyway, I thought I would read some old poems and then work my way forward to some new poems. But then I decided it would be much more exciting and pleasurable to read some new poems. And if I have time, then I'll go back to some old ones. Some of the students who were in my class today on my question and answer might get some revenge. You still can't hear me?
You have to talk into it, Charlie.
Talking.
You have to be close to it, I think.
What's interesting, with all the technological advances we've made, the public speaking thing is still in the 19th century somewhere. You never go anywhere with it. Can you turn this up a little? All right. Yeah, there we go. The sun, the saint, the sot. O sun, bright star, our star, dearest, nearest, how solacing you remain, how consoling your illuminations, what relief on a day in our epoch of dire planet anguish to have you flinging your reliable light. O cosmological fastballer, underwhelming only to the demented, like that saint who conceived you, quote, groaning for deliverance, unquote, which you promised that in the end you'd, quote, trade your shining carapace for, unquote. Deliverance? Carapace? Son, can you hear my teeth grinding? Can you hear my dried out, battered brain, my already broken down thought thing rattling like a bean in a gourd down a hill in a hailstorm? It's because they're still here around us, the soul gobblers, the God-slobbing carapace snatchers who stalk from their altars to government chambers to blight what's left of our earthly adventure. Wrenching, no shameful, no hideous, frightening, to admit I too once yearned to believe as they do, because I desired, craved the peace Buddha and Blake and innocent gospel Thomas kept humming about, because I wished rapture as much as the tits, thighs, and asses that obsessed me then, in truth more, as now the future, the inferno doom of our darling Earth's future obsesses me more even than that. O future, O earth orphan, that you, irresistible gleamer, cunningly coaxed into your orbit, our world in its robes of azure and lace is dimming. We have to behold its darkening denouements. And where are the Bibles that buoy me? Where are the Vedas, the I Chings, the shamanic ravings, whose useless pages I stuff myself with in the abyss of my intellectual, spiritual uncoming of age? Back to the story. What happens next, I'm sure you'll recall, all beholder. Philosophy finds me. Philosophy with a swirl of its logical cape and its chariot of gilded conceptual calves comes to me in the form of that teacher in college with lamentable teeth, the same alarming beige hue as his toupee, who gazed out the window as he lectured and sometimes would drift to a stop and smile to himself. Because, he finally admitted, he was content because he was a follower of Berkeley and Kant and their ilk, who'd conclusively proved that, quote, only mind and its mental objects exist, unquote. And yes, I thought, yes, that's the answer I need, because weren't they saying that nothing was real except in my psyche? Even you, son, were a match flare. Nothing actual was true. And if I wanted to, I could make it all stop. As now I find myself telling it all to just stop. I find myself pleading, just all go away, go away. The glaciers melting, the tundra turning to methane, the oceans rotting to scum. Blot them, erase them. But here's my professor again. And here am I, noting that more often than not in class he was tipsy, and the rumor that he spent his weekend self-exiled on Skid Row must have been tragically true. So how could I not understand that this was where such epistemological hijinks would lead me, to drink hemlock and lie down with the nameless and shameless and hope again it would all go away? Thus were you saved, mighty unflincher, and now as craven as we are before our wounded world, save us. Let us linger in your lethal warmth. Don't scant our meager spinnings in the great celestial waltz. Here's a more concrete one. Hog. Hog, as in pig. She said, is it like this? Now you'll see. In a certain town in New Jersey where now will be found malls, car dealerships, drive-thrus, highways with synchronized lights, a motor vehicle office, a store selling discount something or other, I can't remember what else, but haven't we all experienced such post-agrarian transmogrifications? In a certain town in New Jersey once was a farm farmed by a Jewish farmer, who, my goodness, a notion I'd never entertained. Jews were lawyers, accountants, doctors, maybe salesmen, until a friend took me to meet one, his mother's brother, who lived somewhere I'd never heard of. In a certain town in New Jersey, not far from where I am now, existed a farmer who was also a Jew, who'd eluded the Second War murders by leaving for the States with nothing in his wallet or satchel but a hammer and saw and a handful of nails, and worked his way through the shit pit of Europe to here, where he went back with somebody else's money, some earlier escapee arrival, maybe his sister's, to farming, which had been his family's trade for many generations in the old country, he boasted. And there he was on his farm with his chickens and corn, and I saw 3 or 4 cows and some pigs, and on this day a dead hog, that is to say a hog he'd only just slaughtered, that hung upside down from a hook in a rafter and a stout iron chain, and which the farmer, the Jewish farmer, was flinging boiling water against, flinging and flinging, so its bristles would soften, which I could see they had, for then he was scraping the hog with a crescent-shaped length of steel, and the bristles were listening, and I gathered that when they were gone he'd be, how had the word ever found me, gutting the hog. And there was a gleaming, well-honed knife at the ready, whose task, I could tell, was slicing you open as you horribly swung there, colorless gunk spooling out of your snout, while the booted farmer methodically effected the everlasting labor of farmers, Jewish or not, pulling you with his knotty arms and leather gloves towards him to cut you apart and sell you, I supposed, is what would come next. In a certain town in New Jersey, might anyone remain to ask forgiveness for the concrete and asphalt, the forest felled for McMansions, the eternally lost corn and wheat fields and vanished orchards? Might anyone recall the sweet stink of manure, of tiled earth, the odor even of fresh blood on a floor? And who beside me will remember the farmer, so imposing in the masterful exercise of his calling, who with a snort and a clap on the back forgave me the gawk of my adolescence, as imagining the rest of what life would be bringing, I knelt by a rusting, soon-to-be scrapped hay rake and threw up. Well, thank you. That's nice. I haven't read any of these, so. This is called Soul and Steel, and it has an epigraph from Montaigne. You should have said that they were men of, you would have said that they were men of iron. They had heard accoutrements. They had head accoutrements so neatly fitted. Got that? Not frail, not faint-hearted, flighty, and I certainly don't mean merely to mean unmale with those now happily unacceptable connotations of frivolous, faithless, flirty. Emphatically no innuendo like that. I mean, rather, shouldn't I be able to conceive a yes, unmale soul for this bundle of matter and pain with qualities that might seem feminine, fragile, but that would enlarge instead of diminish me? Some other soul something that might one day contain all of life I've omitted because my manly, I have to admit my all too often martial, militaristic soul machine with its invariably impatient, enraged and raging responses squats boiling in my cockpit like a senator calling again for more war, enacting those testosterone rituals that finish always in slashes and snarls and the will to prevail. Prevail, prevail. I glare at you through my eye holes. I snort through the rifled slits of my nostrils, the fumes of your terror, or is it my own? My brain solder hardens in the aching shells of my ears, so I can't hear myself begging for pity, can't hear myself beseeching not to be slaughtered, as I've been in every one of my soul lives, every one of my tales and legends, every lamentable re-existing in history. Where does it come from, this prevailing? Whence arises this ravenousness for victory, for triumph? Must I wait hopelessly as my timorous, untested soul tries to emerge in me like a newborn and survive when I revert again, when I'm fighter again, hero again, warrior, king, helplessly once more who I am, waving my spear, manifesting my soul of steel screwed down and gestures of rage and reflexive revenge. Reconceived soul, terrified of the ever-violent world, what shall I comfort her with? With what shall I sing her? Oh, beauty, beauty, my love sighed, when a doe materialized to gaze at us from the marge of a wood. Oh, beauty, beauty, wouldn't that be enough? Not Persephone, Eve, or Helen, not even Anna or Molly. Just that voice that rises without your willing it to and breathes, beauty, beauty. Wouldn't that be enough? So now I have to figure out poems that might make you applaud every time. I'll only read a selection from these new ones. And then I'll read some older ones. The economy rescued by my mother returning to shop. I sleep as always these dark days a quiver. I awake a tremble, my limbs jerk. I thrash like a gaffed shark. No, not shark, too many sharks already. Fiscal, financial. That's why, gullible guppy I was, I thought the boom wouldn't bust, the bubble not burst, shred, leave us hanging over this thorny, dollarless void. Market staggered, sails down the chute, confidence off the cliff, the aisles of the box stores and chains, deep-peopled ghost towns, even the parking lots empty, the lane lines in martial formation like wings stripped of their feathers, forlornly signaling for interstellar relief. How not quiver, not jerk and thrash? Wait, don't give up too soon. Here comes my mother, back from beyond, and she's going to shop. Avid, sharp-eyed, alert, gleaming and beaming as she always was in our old bus expeditions downtown, with a vigilance keen and serene, and hands entity sentient and shrewd, cunningly separate from her, evolved to analyze things intrinsic or better overlooked worth as they collate the goods on their racks, a blouse in silk and on sale. A blouse and silk and on sale, which she knows and which she shows an admiring mirror, and opens her wallet and buys as that president told us we should, though only my mother, though only my mother has sufficient passion to effect this. Didn't I once watch her unwrap a pair of new shoes to inhale the scent of their unblemished soles? And in the very next quarter, didn't the GNP begin to stir, the number of long-term unemployed slip because of my mother's single-minded devotion to the subtlest aspects of commerce and exchange? And all this after growing up poor in my grandmother's half-starving canned green pea kitchen, and after surviving depression and war. How did she garner so much abstruse lore on redistribution? How accrue so many practical speculations about what we need to correct these failures and flops? Delighted the gods of money must be to behold her again as she conveys herself through their portals. Here's ingenious Hephaestus devising for our enchantment his gadgets and gizmos and glitter, and here Hermes, publicity, marketing, sales, not Hermes, shrine for the rich and pretend rich, and vast Hades who lurks in the fear beneath all, waiting to drag us down to the realm of dire want, where a hound with 3 heads, a bankers, a hedge funds, and underprime mortgage brokers snarls as my mother, who once filched from her sister coin she didn't have to buy me an ice cream, croons as she crooned then, make it last, and retires to her couch and opens her credit card statement and pays. Isn't it splendor to be able to pay for your new skirt, your sheer stockings, your eau de toilette, and so redeem the Dow and the NASDAQ and hallow us all for our humble hungers, our almost innocent greed. Mantis. What in the name of anything on earth was I doing crawling behind a billboard next to a bakery a few blocks from the grammar school I attended then, which recently made it into the news because drug dealers killed some teenagers there, 3 boys and a girl, making them kneel by a wall I realized must be the one in the field where we used to have gym class, and gunning them down. Beneath the billboard seethed eons of trash, rotted food, shit, human or dog, who knows what else, except I knew what else as soon as I saw it. A praying mantis, 4 or 5, maybe more inches long, on a swaying weed not a foot from my face, an appalling contrivance I'd never seen even a picture of, but with its swiveling ball-bearing head and opaque, expressionless eyes, I knew wanted to harm me, gunning them down. What would our kindly teachers, hands white with chalk dust, have thought? Our violence was games like dodgeball, or its other name when we played it inside, bombardment. The bigger kids blasting balls off the backs of the smaller with much groaning and feigned cries of pain, gunning them down. The mind skims from reason to cause to reason, but nothing coheres. The female mantis bites the head off, then devours its male after they couple, which means fuck, I guessed, when I looked up in the book of knowledge, the monster with which I'd had my run-in. Though the texts claimed they were harmless, I still believe the malevolent creature gazing at me, those 4 claws barbed like a lumberjack's saw, had been gathering the rest of itself to attack. What's there now, I wonder? Would the bakery still be, and the billboard? Though what was a billboard doing anyway at the very edge of our city? What would it have been hawking? Soap, cigarettes, cars. In memory, those were the days before everything was for sale, before buying and selling became all. But maybe I'm wrong. I just don't remember. There's so much I've managed not to remember. I haven't seen a mantis for a long time, but if I met one, I wouldn't be frightened of it, but for it. So fragile they look, so brittle, their ill-fitting parts fastened together like biplanes from the First World War. When I'd escaped mine that day, I headed home, taking as you still could in those pre-heroin years, a shortcut through the schoolyard where kids were playing hide and seek behind that same wall. I'll read some older ones now. I had a question and answer today with a bunch of young smarties. And we talked about prose poems. My last book is prose poems, and so I thought I would read a few. This is one I referred to in our meeting, called Poets. When I marked up with my red felt tip pen the last poem my longtime poet friend had sent me, I meant to demonstrate again my allegiance with him, sharing his poem as for so many years we'd shared the labor we both loved. When he decided, I've never fathomed the reason or reasons he wanted to terminate our friendship. He did it by slashing the draft of a poem I'd sent him with his own thicker red scrawls, so savagely, irrationally, with such perverse inattention. I immediately suspected he was informing me our friendship was over, and I was right. I wrote back anyway, discreetly pointing out the off-the-pointedness of most of the criticism he's inflicted on my poem, hoping to effect a kind of treaty between us, but he never responded and never spoke to me again. I suppose I'd known one day this would happen. My ex-friend had often turned on other close friends, suddenly finding them wanting, deciding they'd insulted or hurt him, and hating them. An awful human being is the way he'd fiercely characterized those he had cast aside. It had always troubled me how abruptly someone could go from being one of his valued familiars to an awful human being, but I hadn't dared mention it for fear he'd turn on me too. As I looked again at that sheet of paper with my vulnerable poem stained with his indelible scarlet rage, the coarse delete marks, the arrows, and harsh comments, so much like blood spilling warm from a wound, I wondered if I was a little relieved that the inevitable had come to pass, that I was a member now of a certain select, if unfortunate, society. But I wasn't relieved. Awful human being I am, I wrote this. I have a sequence of poems about my wife, and incidentally me. You can't be my wife without having me, luckily. Anyway, it was published as a little book called Catherine's Laughter, and it had, 25 segments, and I'll just read a few of them to give they're in the prose book all at once. Faster. When the workmen came to unclog the cesspool of the tiny house in Greece Catherine and I had rented those first weeks we were together, they heaved the syrupy shit gunk into the shallow cove in front of our terrace, and it settled through the vividly clear water into a gray layer on the rocks and pebbles at the bottom and stayed there. The reason they did it was because the water that fed the house had been contaminated, but it was even more foul now. We couldn't drink, cook, or even shower with it. There was a well, though, a little way up the hill behind us, and we'd walk there with a big ceramic jug to rinse ourselves off. The water was clean, but cold. I hated it. Catherine appeared not to mind, But when I'd pour the water over her head and it would run down her body, her skin would erupt in goosebumps. What a crude term for such a lovely phenomenon. And she'd all at once possess a different sort of corporality, solidity, depth, breathtaking. Another breathtaking, another absurdly inadequate word. My breath really would be taken. I'd gasp. My breathing would stop, then start again, faster, faster. I don't have to clap. This one is called Talk. Catherine and I have, for some long-forgotten reason, been irritable all day, touchy, preoccupied, moody, and gloomy. Dinner is peaceful, though, and when we finish, Catherine asks, "Are we going to make love tonight?" I answer, "If I'm talking to you, you don't have to talk," Catherine says. Oaks. After dinner, still at the table, I'm writing in my little notebook, scribbling fast, when Catherine says she'd like to take a walk. When I tell her I'm busy, she takes the empty dishes into the kitchen, then comes back. "Come on, take a walk." "I'm writing," I tell her. "Take your notebook. You can take your wine, too." "Wait just a minute," I say. "You need a bigger notebook," Catherine says. "Then I'll buy you a bigger notebook." "I don't need a bigger notebook, and don't get me one." "That's why I said it," Catherine says. "I just wanted to hear you say that. Come on, let's go for a walk." Finally, I give in. We stroll out across the park near our house and come to the pair of gigantic old oaks Catherine particularly loves. The trunk of each tree is about 5 feet across, and they stand close together, leaning a little, as though making room for one another. They're in full-leaved gorgeousness right now, and when we get to them, Catherine says, "You have to come in here," and leads me between them. "Now close your eyes," she says. "Why?" "Because there are all those branches above us, and beneath us the roots. You have to listen." I listen, but I start to object. "You have to come to stand here every day, then you will." Catherine answers, not laughing now. "You'll see, you will." It's getting thinner and thinner. I should see what time it is. 60. When I offhandedly remarked to my father how sad it was that his good friend Saul would be dying next year, he startled and asked, "What do you mean?" And I answered, "Well, he'll be 60, won't he? So he'll die." And my father said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, when you're 60, that's when you die. Everybody knows that." And then my father disabused me. Is that the term of that notion? Which it turns out was true for the men on the island, Kia, where the poet Simonides came from, because when they hit 60, all the males drank hemlock and removed themselves, got out of the way, you might put it, which doesn't seem like that bad an idea when I wake creaking and crackling and drag myself out of my sleep. And also sometimes just seeing something like that half-fossilized woman yesterday in the street, old with a too short skirt. Many, are they still called, bright tights and high leather boots, thick makeup, head shaved, and one long earring dangling. And my God, what's she thinking, I thought. Then glimpsed in my mind what pleasure for her it must have been to put her face on, choose the outfit, unroll the tights, don the sweater, hook on the earring, then whoop, out the door. And I remembered also what it was for myself this morning when I was shaving. Number 60, long gone, old yellow teeth like teeth in a skull. Then I saw in the glass indeed a skull, my skull, orbs dead as moons, cracked grin, leering. And how could I have let myself get so old, I thought. I must not have paid enough attention. I must have left too many days only partly put to use. Otherwise it would have taken longer to get here. Longer, so much longer. I guess I have to stop. I'll read one more poem, a New York poem that I like a lot. Whoops. The Neighbor. Her 5 horrid, deformed little dogs who incessantly yap on the roof under my window. Her cats, God knows how many, who must piss on her rugs, her landings a sickening reek. Her shadow once fumbling the chain on her door, then the door slamming fearfully shut, only the barking and the music, jazz filtering as it does day and night into the hall. The time was Chris Connor singing Lush Life, and how it brought back my college sweetheart, my first real love, who till I left her played the same record, and head on my shoulder, hand on my thigh, sang sweetly along of regrets and depletions she was too young for, as I was too young later to believe in her pain. It startled, then bored, then repelled me. My starting to fancy she'd ended up in this fire trap in the village, that my neighbor was her. My thinking we'd meet, recognize one another, become friends, that I'd accomplish a penance. My seeing her, it wasn't her, at the mailbox, gray yellow hair, army pants under a nightgown, her turning away, hiding her ravaged face in her hands, muttering an inappropriate hi. Sometimes there are frightening goings-on in the stairwell, a man shouting, "Shut up," the dogs frantically snarling, claws scrabbling, then her voice, hoarse, harsh, hollow, almost only a tone, incoherent, a note, a squawk, bone on metal, metal gone molten, calling them back. Come back, darlings, come back, dear ones, my sweet angels, come back. Medea she was, next time I saw her, sorceress, trance, ecstatic, stock still on the sidewalk, ragged coat hanging agape, passers-by flowing around her, her mouth torn suddenly open, as though in a scream. Silently, though, as though only in her brain or breast had it erupted, a cry so pure, practiced, detached, it had no need of a voice or could no longer bear one. These invisible links that allure, these transfigurations even of anguish that hold us. The girl, my old love, the last time I saw her when she came to find me at a party, her drunkenly stumbling, falling, sprawling, skirt hiked, eyes veined red, swollen with tears, her shame, her dishonor, my ignorant, arrogant coarseness, my secret pride, my turning away. Still life on a rooftop, dead trees and barrels, a bench broken, dogs, excrement, sky. What pathways through pain, what junctures of vulnerability, what crossings and counterings. Too many lives in our lives already, too many chances for sorrow, too many unaccounted for pasts. Behold me, the God of frenzied, inexhaustible love says, rising in bloody splendor, behold me. Her making her way down the littered vestibule stairs, one agonized step at a time, my holding the door, her crossing the fragmented tiles, faltering at the step to the street, droning, not looking at me. Can you help me? Taking my arm, leaning lightly against me, her wavering step into the world, her whispering, thanks, love, lightly, lightly against me. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. There they go.
So,
Okay, I'm not finished. Hang on. I still have got one more. I was saving this one. What? Yeah. I was talking to my assembled geniuses this afternoon about this poem, which was terribly hard to finish. Haven't you got enough pictures of me? You what? Okay. Dear reader, dearest inscrutable listener, inscrutably harking, or regrettably more likely not harping, except in that chamber in me that posits you with me every moment I'm speaking or trying to speak. Dear reader who may or may not be with you, I still remember how once you weren't here at all, so I'd make up a mythical listener, and there were good sides to that, because I could choose the degree of your presence, the level of your attention from 0 to 50. But then before I knew it, you were somehow actually with me, though it's still a mystery as to why you decided to join me. But mystery or not, in another before I knew it, the make-believe between us suddenly changed to your not being with me. Because if I thought of you paying attention too closely, you'd daunt me. This far along, though, all that's all over, because if we're together or not, if you're harking or not, this far along, all that's over, because if we're together or not, if you're harking or not, we've had our good times. We've had our times, good and bad. And with whom, after all, have I passed more intimate hours? With whom communed more? To whom given over more of the secrets I swore when they barbed me I'd keep to myself forever? Though I know now there's never forever, and know too, dear reader, here with me or not, that there aren't any secrets I'd care any longer to keep. So if you're still out at your end of the page as I'm still scribbling here at mine, all that's left to convey are my thanks. I brought the wrong fucking last line. It ended with the reader sitting at his end of the page and me scribbling at my end of the page. Oh, what a disappointment. You must be offended, I can tell. All right, now it's questions and answers.
Well, first. So Gabriel has a microphone there. Anna, will somebody be bringing? Anyway, if you can wait to have the microphone arrive, then everybody can hear your question. And also, I just want to say thank you, Charlie. It was a beautiful reading. And it's such a pleasure to have him here, as well as Mr. Edmund White and Sharon Olds and other pals. So thanks a lot, everybody. And Q&A will now proceed.
Okay, when I'm gonna everybody who was in our group this afternoon, I'm gonna send the right version of that poem to Tom, and you can read it.
Okay.
so if you have a question, put up your hand, and Anna will bring the mic over for you to speak into.
What? I can sit here a long time.
Thank you for that reading. When you talk about that last poem being hard to finish,
Yeah.
how do you know when a poem is finished, or what feeling do you have when something feels complete for you?
It's easier to say how you know something's incomplete. It's easier to say, to know when something's incomplete. First of all, you can show it to a friend and the friend will say, back to the drawing board. Or you can wait another day with yourself and look at it and realize, here's some soft spots, here's some smudges. So that's the way it happens. Next. Way in the back.
Hi, how are you? Whoa, sorry. I just have a question. Do you have a definition of poetry? Like, what's your definition?
I've made, as all poets do, I've probably made 50 different definitions of poetry. I'm trying to think of one of the quicker ones. For a poet, anyway, a poem is the sound and meaning of your inner voice, of the voice that's only yours. And a poem is a revealing of aspects of that inner voice that you didn't know existed. That's one meaning. Next. Yes?
Why poetry?
Why poetry? My gosh.
When did you decide?
How did you? You mean I shouldn't do it?
Just out of curiosity.
It's a curious question. I don't know why I started. I just started. I was 19. And I wrote what I called a poem. It was awful. And then another one. And I realized, I've said this before, it was the first adult activity besides sex that I really enjoyed. So I just kept going. There was no justification for my doing it. I have a friend who's a literary agent, and when I win a prize, she's there always, because as a literary agent. And the first time she said, "Charlie, of all the people I know, you're the last I thought would ever become a poet." I couldn't disagree. Come, we can't stop. I'm having such a good time. Yeah.
You said the first poem you wrote was awful. What made it awful? What was awful about it?
It was nothing. It was just scribbled prose. The way most 19-year-olds, if you give them a pencil and a piece of paper, will write. Or maybe it's most 13 years old, because I was about there.
The look of the long line with the did in their first drafts, did those poems go all
They're meant to go all the way. It's the fault of the paper makers, because their papers are
so great about
about. See, I never think that. I just think, what a pain in the neck. It's not my whole line. We've talked about that before, you know. I don't forget.
I was just wondering, speaking of the long
Could you
lines.
stand up?
Yes. I was just wondering, speaking of the long lines, how you find your rhythm for the long lines. Is it sort of a breathless line, do you feel like, or is it? I was just wondering how that sort of comes out of you, since a lot of your lines are long that way, even if they aren't intentionally broken at the end, right?
It's hard to describe what goes on with free verse. Everybody knows that. For me, the way I would say it is that every poem has a cadence that's waiting to be enacted. And you can't really start the poem. You can write hundreds of pages and trying to get ready for a poem. But unless that cadence starts that begins to take your voice, you don't have a poem. And when the cadence starts, it begins to generate meaning, which is perhaps its most important function, at least for the poet. And I think that the word cadence is, for me, the only word that works sufficiently with free verse, which is what I write. Yes, Edmund.
In your poems, I always feel like you never sort of go on automatic and just write from the beginning to the end. I always feel like you must stop at some point and reposition yourself. Do you take breaks, or do you write poems at one sitting? But they seem to me like they would take several days.
Or several months. Or several years. I mean,
Yeah.
Literally.
Because,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, one of the wonderful things about them is that they're not predictable. I mean, in other words, we hear a stanza, and then it's as though you stopped and thought about it and repositioned yourself somehow vis-a-vis the same subject matter, but from an entirely different angle.
Yeah, like a novelist.
Yeah.
I do that. It's part of my method, for sure. Not to stop when the first idea has been satisfied, or the first impulse. To keep going and see where else you can go with it. It's definitely basic to my method.
It seems that, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for noticing it. That's Edmund White, the great novelist.
Following on from that question, have you ever had a poem that you did just write and it pretty much came out just the way you wanted it on the first draft, as legend has it, Ode to a Nightingale did, pretty much first time out? Or do you always have to draft multiple times?
I've had a few that just came out. That's great. You don't have to sit there and struggle and think of things like cadences. I've probably had a bunch of them. None of the longer ones, actually, but some shorter ones. Yeah, it's a nice feeling. But it's the same feeling when you're writing well, whether you're writing a whole poem. It's so thrilling to be writing well, or to be writing something that satisfies you, and something that possibly points toward the future of the poem or a future of the poem that you hadn't thought of. In a way, that's a really good reason that's why poetry. Got it? So have we had enough, you think? There's one more.
When do you write? Do you have a schedule or a discipline or?
Yeah, I write every morning until lunchtime. But it isn't always writing. You know, I read too, I jump around. But I do have a schedule. I've had it, once I decided to become a poet, and I was so late in deciding, and I had no talent that I could see, I just decided the only thing I can do is work. So I worked. Okay, wait, one more. Okay.
I'm actually going to plagiarize this question from my humanities professor, John Priest. I don't know where he is, but what made you decide to switch to, not totally switch, but switch to prose poetry rather than quote-unquote regular poetry, and how is the experience of writing that different?
I spoke about that this afternoon. My prose poems are actually failed. My prose poems are actually failed, most of them, failed verse poems that I just couldn't get to work. And I told some people today, so I started going through them and turning them into prose, and it was much harder than I thought it would be. I thought I'd just take out the commas or something. And it wasn't like that at all. It became a project in its own right. So it took a couple of years. Okay, thank you.